Space Marine army lists having changed quite so much in the last balance updates, let's take a look at the top 10 units that are getting the most table time in strong lists and talk about what makes them so good. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this video I thought we'd take a look over the units that seem to be doing best for the Astartes right now, with a rough top 10 of those seeing the most tournament play in successful competitive lists. It's not been so very long since Games Workshop did a big Space Marine update in December, boosting Oath of Moment, giving a whole bunch of datasheets overhauls, and also giving some improvements to Roboute Guilliman, and since then Space Marines have been doing rather well. Finally no longer on the bottom of the barrel stats-wise for Warhammer 40k. The overall tournament win rates for the faction are quite well balanced at around 49%, though that does kind of hide the fact that Ultramarines are doing absolutely great and the other chapters far less so. And as ever, Space Marine chapters still have some big winners and losers. Ultramarines in particular do seem to be doing absolutely standout in terms of top level play though, around about 20 grand tournament wins or 5-0 undefeated runs in 2025 so far. And as best I can tell, that's roughly double the next competitors to them, which even with accounting for the fact that they're the most played faction is still massively standout versus the crowd. I feel like it's perhaps often the case with Space Marines that there tends to be a big gulf between the absolute hyper-optimised meta lists versus the average list that people might put on the table, and I was interested to take a look in exactly what units are considered the meta ones right now, what are top players judging as worth it, and which ones are getting left at home. Just for a snapshot of what's doing well, I looked at 22 competitive lists that have done well at tournaments, placing on the podiums for grand tournaments, and in general these tend to represent Gladius, Vanguard and Ironstorm army lists as the most played and most successful Space Marines out there, though there were a few other things mixed in with that. Between detachments though, there are certainly things that vary with detachments that I'll talk about at the end, though it seems there's a fair amount of conversion on a whole bunch of Space Marine datasheets that just seem to be really strong, kind of regardless of detachment, and you're almost never going to have a particularly bad time justifying them in any one army list. I thought we could go through those in order of people picking them, talk about the units and any recent updates, what makes them strong and how they tend to get used in terms of war gear and things in practical lists. First up, I thought I'd go through 4 units that were just outside the top 10, getting either 6 or 7 selections out of that sample of lists. First up, the Gladiator Reaper seems to have made a bit of a comeback, 160 points for the twin Gatling cannon tank, 12 shots at strength 6 with twin linked and devastating wounds, and then getting a bonus sustained hits 2 against infantry. These things just have massively efficient damage profiles against infantry in general, including things with really high saves due to those devastating wounds, but in particular, obviously they're massively efficient against lighter infantry, stacking a crazy number of saves and deleting entire squads of hordes in one go. They usually tend to be used as a just one per list to cover the sort of anti-horde style role, and maybe seem to be more common in Ironstorm or Guilliman Gladius style lists, often ones that spam a bunch of tank holes like Vindicators or Ballistus Dreadnoughts. Those tanks are really effective against big heavy things, where these can be rather good to take out lighter infantry units if they present en masse. Could be nice against certain armies like Guard Scions perhaps, and perhaps make some good use of stratagems, such as the Ironstorm one where you get the critical hits on a 5+, that's rather brutal with sustained hits too, and particularly in Oath of Moment. Otherwise, we've got the Inceptors here as well. They were taken in 7 out of the 22 lists. Seems that losing 3-inch deep strike was a fair enough trade-off for the 120 points they cost. It doesn't look like people are taking any less of them than they were before. They're certainly more efficient for damage output with either assault bolters or plasma, dropping in close to the enemy if they need to, and reaching unusual targets, and then hitting hard with a whole bunch of twin-linked fire. With twin linked and also potentially +1 to wound from Oath of Moment, they can be a threat to things that are far heavier than you might expect. Both the bolters and the plasma are very usable against the right targets. I think they're well balanced, and in terms of detachments they tend to be more used in Vanguard compared with elsewhere. Vanguard list with their bonus shooting stratagem and their return to reserve stratagem are both rather excellent for them. They often tend to get spammed in multiple units there, with other lists if they take them maybe just taking 1 unit of 3 for a dedicated unit to drop close to the enemy if they need to threaten to do certain secondary objectives and things. Next up, for a unit whose use really seems to have taken off in recent times, is the Stormspeeder Hammerstrike. 125 points for a chunky Landspeeder equivalent. This one spitting out 9 strength 9 shots with multi-damage, though needing to get fairly close if it wants to put that Melter Destroyer to good use. The special rule that this guy gets is to strip cover from one target, and it feels like this one was really one that's jumped up in use due to the Oath of Moment changes. Previously, if people were taking a buffing Stormspeeder, it tended to be the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike, giving you a +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles, but now you have Oath of Moment for a +1 to wound, and particularly if Guilliman's on the table, you don't really need the +1 to wound from a Thunderstrike, and this one instead is the more useful one with the stripping cover from a target and getting all your weapons hitting with better AP effectively. Its own damage profiles really aren't bad with +1 to wound, oath of moment either, so there's more synergy there. Strength 9 with +1 to wound and those big damage profiles will take big chunks out of heavies, and it's rather nice for supporting good Space Marine firepower units like any of their gun tanks, maybe in particular Ballistus Dreadnoughts and Vindicators at the moment. Finally, and again only just out of the top 10, with 7 selections out of the 22 lists that I looked at, are the Assault Intercessors with jump packs, 90 points for a unit of 5 Primaris Assault Marines, getting some impact hits with a bunch of mortal wounds when they slam into their targets, and enough anti-elite things to be a nuisance to tougher stuff than lighter infantry too, a couple of plasma pistols and a power fist hidden in the squad. They're fairly cheap at 90 points and a quite good secondary duo unit. They can deep strike to do certain secondaries without committing too many points to it, and then move quite fast to keep them relevant and in the fight after they do so. If they need to in certain detachments, they can hit pretty hard as well. They could make use of the Gladius Lance stratagem if they really need to win one key positional fight, and could make good use of Oath of Moment if they need to do the same as well. And they're really quite good for other divergent chapters out there, particularly Blood Angels, making all those chainswords strength 6 on the charge. Where they're taking a fair few lists seem to run maybe a couple of squads of 5, taking the Power Fist and Plasma Pistols, though a couple of lists ran big squads of them with Kavan Shrike, for a couple of lists daring to look beyond Ultramarines. Those are the most notable honourable mentions, but before we jump into the big top 10 itself, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain, one option for notably easy to store and transport Warhammer 40k terrain, with their folding cardboard system that works a bit differently to most out there. The idea of this stuff is that you have a set of 12 tiles making a 45 by 60 inch board. Each of those tiles unfolds and up pops a building, giving you a fairly quick and ready to go 40k battlefield that can all store in a box set the same sort of size as a normal board game. They've got a few different sets on offer for different colours and stylings, which I'll talk about at the end of the video briefly. And in general, the main selling points are its portability and ease of use, given that you don't need to do any hobby work to make it happen. Though obviously it does come with a few trade-offs due to the whole pop-up cardboard folding nature of the thing. I'll talk about those a bit more at the end of the video though for those interested. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to have a look at their stuff, and in any case a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Into the top 10 most selected units in general though, and first up we have the Primaris Incursors. These were taken in 9 of my selection of 22 army lists, 80 points per 5 of these, and these ones are the Scouting Space Marines in Phobos armour, whose special ability is to give you +1 to hit on one marked target that one of the guys pings their guns into. That means that they're really just quite a cheap and efficient force multiplier for a gunline Space Marine army. Anything with big heavy firepower will quite like that. As mentioned, Ballistus Dreads and Vindicators seem to be one of the favoured things right now. And between that, Oath of Moment, and potentially stripping cover from a hammer strike, you could have a pretty crazy amount of buffs all going into one tough target. In the balance update, they gained AP-1 combat blades, which was a pretty significant increase in their damage output, particularly given that you get sustained hits 1 on them, they get some bolt shots, and also their Haywire Mine is definitely worth considering as well, potentially 2d3 wounds if they get close to a vehicle at some point, or d3 wounds to something else, and that could also trigger if they get charged as well. Between all that, there's just a whole ton of utility there. The extra AP and melee really help them out, though most commonly they still tend to get used as just one unit of 5 of them, given that you get diminishing returns after having one copy of marking a unit for +1 to hit, particularly when you've got Oath of Moment going around for other rerolls for other things. Next up, and for another drastically improved datasheet, we've got the Intercessor squad, 80 points per 5 and 160 per 10, and they were used in 11 of the 22 army lists. They get sticky objectives, which is often handy to have one copy of. You can use them to mark your home objective with that, and then move up to the midfield where they've got some high OC. And compared with a lot of other Space Marine skirmish infantry, they've got a fair bit of personal damage output now. They get a grenade launcher, and the sergeant gets a power fist, and have enough bolt shots to worry lighter infantry, and particularly given the balance update gave them a vast amount of extra bolt shots to throw at the enemy. If they all focus fire on the same target, which they almost always will in a squad of 5, then you get 20 bolt shots out of 5 of them, which is kind of insane for 80 points. And they also have the assault and heavy keywords, and also have the grenade launcher as well. Overall just a very efficient unit, though again like the Incursors they often just tend to get used as one unit of 5 in an army list, given that you have excess value from 1 for getting a copy of that sticky objectives rule in the army, and in general you don't usually tend to need to go absolutely massively big into anti-horde style damage, as Space Marines tend to have a good amount of threat against them anyway, so they don't really seem to be being spammed at all. Next up, we've got the alternative build option for the Incursors in the Infiltrator squad. These guys have been a staple with their 12-inch deep strike denial bubble, usually to hold the home field objective. They do pay a premium at that, at 100 points per squad of 5 of them. It still seems that denying reserves in such a wide area is still worthy of the investment, even after 3-inch deep strikes got nerfed. Otherwise, as their name would heavily suggest, they do have Infiltrators as well, so if your opponent doesn't happen to have any big reserve units, you could just put them as a mid-board skirmish unit in the matchups where it doesn't really matter too much. And while they don't really do all that much damage, they're a little bit chunkier and sturdier than, say, Space Marine Scouts, having a 3+ save and a 6+ feel no pain from the Helix Gauntlet. Again, they often tend to get sold via their special rule, so always turn up in units of 5, most lists only taking one of them, usually to guard the home field and then use alternatively otherwise, though a couple of lists do take a couple of them, and some choose to take a Phobos Librarian along as well to stop them from being shot at long ranges. That basically gives you a unit that the opponent can't arrive too close to and can't shoot from far away either. Next up, we've got the Company Heroes. The Primaris Command Squad is 95 points. They are present in 13 of the 22 army lists, though their ranking is so high here due to Ultramarines domination really, given that they seem to be the squad of choice to escort Marneus Calgar or Uriel Ventris as a chunky squad with a bunch of defense and still being alright in melee as well. You get a 4-man squad of them, and the individual models are fairly tough. Toughness 4 with 4 wounds, and OC 2 due to their banner, and when they have the character attached that they must have attached, they're -1 to wound overall, meaning that they have a ton of durability for the points. They're particularly nice with Marneus Calgar due to those Victrix Honour Guards, which can give you yet more chunky profiles with a 2+ save and 4+ invulnerable, and they both add more melee threat to the unit if it's undamaged, and potentially could be used to tank some really big hits on them, having higher saves than the rest of the unit both in terms of regular armour and invulnerables. For their own damage output, they still have a fairly scary profile on the champion, with a bunch of strength 5 damage 2 attacks with precision, and then a bit of shooting with the heavy bolter and mastercrafted bolt rifle. That's usually going to be a little bit incidental, but it's nice to have a little bit of quality fire in there. Calgar does seem to be the main reason that they're ranking here, though they're also nice for Uriel Ventris as well, and could be good for certain other characters out there, maybe Vulcan Hestan of the Salamanders if you're playing them. Moving upwards, we're getting into units that the vast majority of competitive Space Marines lists right now seem to be running. There's a whole bunch of units that were run by 15 out of the 22 armies I looked at. First up, we have the ever-popular Space Marine Scout Squad. Cheap, effective and expendable units with a lot of their own advantages to start in the midfield. And at 75 points for 5 of them, they're hard to go too far wrong with really, most lists at least taking 1 unit and plenty taking 2 of them as well. They can start on the mid-board to threaten to do mid-board secondaries or hide out of sight on primary objectives, and they have a lot of flexibility due to also having the scout rules, which is really nice to have paired with Infiltrators. It means they can move forward to do first turn move blocks or even threaten lighter units if it makes sense to, and then even have guerrilla tactics where they can return to reserves if that makes sense late game. Just a whole load of stuff that you'd want out of a sort of mid-board utility unit. In general, all their special rules matter a bit more than their exact choice of weapon. Almost every list seems to take the Astartes chainsword, maybe a few more preferring the missile launcher over the heavy bolter, though both are used, and pretty well all of them take 1 heavy weapon. And then for the rest of the gear, there's a lot of variation. Combat knives having gained in popularity, now they gained the extra AP -1. And the sniper rifle seems to be kind of take or leave. Between all that, they're not going to be damage powerhouses, but maybe do a bit more than you might expect for a utility unit with quite this many advantages. Next up, despite tanks like perhaps the Gladiator Lancer dominating in early 10th edition, it seems that currently the Vindicator tank is one of the 2 go-to gun turrets of the Space Marine army. And again, a vast amount of armies are running these, again 15 out of 22 of the army lists that I looked at. They're often being taken in multiples as well, as sort of mainline heavy lifters for the army. Plenty of lists taking 2, some going the whole hog and taking 3. They just have all around fairly good stats. Toughness 11 with 11 wounds and a 2+ save is nice and sturdy, particularly if they can get cover. They can be a nice choice for Armour of Contempt as well, if there's one big hitting shooting attack coming for them. The Demolisher Cannon is going to scare literally anything that it takes aim at. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6 with blast. It's a great profile against tanks and vehicles, and will be converting a lot of wounds if it's backed up by Oath of Moment, re-rolling all hits and then wounding on a 2+. Its siege shield means that it can fire in melee at no effect, so it doesn't have to worry too much about being tagged, and gets nice synergies from Ironstorm Spearhead, quite enjoying the single re-rolls from that one, and is a good hefty tank to use the more powerful stratagems on, maybe things like the sustained hits damage boost, or shooting after it's reduced to less than half health. The big gun tanks tend to be a bit more common in Gladius and Ironstorm versus Vanguard, where Vanguard lists often tend to have a big unit of Centurions warping around and maybe filling the same sort of role. Just on its raw stats though, it's pretty scary for the vast majority of Space Marine lists out there. It's not even wasted against elite infantry either, with blast keywords giving it extra shots against them. Next up, we've got the Combi Weapon Lieutenant, one of the more frustrating models to kill in Warhammer 40k, again in the vast majority of army lists, and this guy gives you a 4 wound lone operative with a 5+ feel no pain and stealth, so not usually going to just get killed by a single burst of small arms fire. He can infiltrate a bit into the midboard if it makes sense to, and then has that pretty disruptive reactive move rule where if an enemy unit moves within 9 inches of him, he gets to normal move 6 inches, where he often hangs around near ruined walls and things, so he'll often just move out of line of sight, move away from enemy charges if you wanted to engage him in close combat, or just move out of lone operative shooting range so the unit can't shoot him at all. As a result, he can be a nice unit for, say, deep strike screening and things, or good to have around for secondary objectives, and might even be able to nab a primary if it's completely uncontested. He also gets a handy enough buffing rule of re-rolling wound rolls of 1 against one given objective marker, pretty nice with Oath of Moment given that you re-roll the hit rolls and a +1 to wound, and it means that very few hits aren't going to wound the enemy, and some lists could be alright for bearing certain enhancements, like say Master of Machine War, or the one to increase the cost of stratagems in Vanguard Spearhead. He's maybe particularly relevant with Guilliman around as well. He's infantry, so can be used to trigger Guilliman's own lone operative protection, so you could tag team them if you want to use him to help keep the Primarch safe from long range firepower. In general, if he's been taken, it's usually just one copy of him as opposed to multiple, but it seems that more successful armies than not are finding him a handy guy to have around. Next up, we have the Ultramarines, Marneus Calgar, also in the majority of lists. Seemingly his points increased to 200 points not having put people off, and with his 2 Victrix Guard bodyguards still seeming like a really popular choice, as mentioned most often with company heroes, though occasionally he can join other things where he can be viable with quite a lot of units really. For his actual damage, Calgar hits hard with a bunch of twin link damage 3 attacks, though the Victrix Guard do loads of work as well with 10 attacks in total at strength 5 and damage 2. And between the lot of them, they sort of turn a middling threat unit into quite a high threat one, seemingly working great with the company heroes as mentioned, and the Victrix Guards can also be good for the unit's defense as well, tanking say high AP shots on their 4+ invulnerables. He gets his units to be able to advance and charge, advance and shoot, and fallback shoot and charge, so all the Gladius thing is rolled into one pretty much, and then often likes to be deployed on the board out of transport, as he'll generate a command point each turn when he is. He's pretty good in most of the detachments. In Gladius he quite likes the Lance melee style stratagem, and his squad can be a nice one for reactive moving either in Gladius or when he's charged in Vanguard. In Vanguard he could potentially be infiltrated with Blade Driven Deep if you want to combo with a different character, and in Ironstorm he might not have quite as many synergies, but just getting those extra command points on the board still often seems to be worth it, given the power of their stratagems but some of them being expensive. Overall it looks like he's just as much a part of the Ultramarines army list makeup as Roboute Guilliman these days. There do seem to be plenty of lists that take Calgar along but not Guilliman. Talking of the Primarch though, he was also in 15 lists, though not necessarily the exact same ones, and obviously that does mean that plenty of people were running both. Guilliman may have got a big points increase in the last updates, but he got rules updates to more than match it really. He does have big melee threats, but perhaps the biggest thing that he's bringing to the table are a free stratagem both in your turn and the opponent's turn within 12 inches, discounting the cost of stratagems by 1 command point, and then also marking 2 units for Oath of Moment. Once you've destroyed the first one, you can move on to the second one. Given that Oath of Moment gives you a +1 to wound now, that's just massively more valuable. It was kind of surprising with that buff that Games Workshop decided to allow him to use both the stratagems and the Oath of Moment in the same turn. Beyond that though, he can absolutely wreck things in melee too. 7 attacks at strength 14 and damage 4 is huge, or fairly brutal 14 attacks at strength 8, damage 2 and devastating wounds with the Emperor's Sword if he needs to clear out an entire squad worth of Space Marines. It's pretty hard to take down just with his base stat line, and particularly because he gets lone operative when he's near infantry units, which could be triggered by the Combi Lieutenant as mentioned, and then the opponent can't really ever bank on killing him in a single round, given that the first time he dies he stands up on a 3+ with 6 wounds remaining, so there's a good chance that investing big in slaying the Primarch isn't actually going to put him down, and then he's going to come back swinging hard. Even at a big 345 point cost, it still seems that he's borderline auto-includes for a whole bunch of lists, and to be honest I really wouldn't be too surprised if Guilliman goes up in points when they next do a balance pass. For the exact army list he tends to get used in, it's maybe a bit more in Gladius and Ironstorm versus Vanguard. It does feel like the synergies of Vanguard don't tend to be quite as big compared with the other two, though he's still very usable there as well of course. Finally, and currently seeming like king of the datasheets from the Space Marine perspective, is the Ballistus Dreadnought, the 10th edition Stompy and Shooty Dreadnought from the Leviathan box set. They're nice and cheap at 130 points, and they were in a big 17 of the 22 army lists, so really commonly included here. They're notably tough for the cost with 12 wounds with a 2+ save, very good for 130 points, and then their damage output is pretty efficient as well, 2 las cannon shots, and 2 missile launcher shots that you can swap out for some anti-horde missiles if it makes more sense, plus a couple of twin-link stormbolters, and they re-roll the hit roll if they target anything that's not below half strength. That perhaps means they're not as overly critical for being buffed with Oath of Moment, though I guess the missile launchers would still definitely appreciate that if they happen to be shooting something that's got a higher toughness than their strength is. They often do seem to be paired with Vindicators, and that would present a pretty intimidating wall of 2+ armor saves, where unless your anti-tank has got good AP, it's not really going to do all that much, and they could also potentially use Armor of Contempt if it's going to be the thing that's focused by a big enemy threat, or if something's trying to one-round them in close combat. It seems a lot of army lists are taking either 2 or 3 of them at the moment, though maybe a bit fewer in Vanguard Spearhead, as mentioned, where Centurions with Uriel Ventris often tend to compete, and having a bunch of the sort of firepower unit points also going to Inceptors as well. Overall, it seems like most Space Marine armies are finding it hard to go too far wrong with a bunch of Vindicators and Ballistus Dreadnoughts if you want some scary firepower on big 2+ save profiles. That's the main top 10 of units that seem to be making it into competitive Space Marine lists at the moment. Perhaps a little bit unusually convergent given just how many Space Marine datasheets are on offer, and I would argue that the vast majority of them are really quite playable. Lots of the choices maybe not really so far behind, though I feel like maybe there's a bit of an element of certain things becoming all very fashionable when some players see other folks winning with them. Obviously, as mentioned, things do vary by detachment a fair bit. Vanguard Spearhead tends to make more use of things like Inceptors and maybe some Eradicators perhaps, maybe some Devastator Centurions with Uriel Ventris too. In Gladius Task Force, I noticed a bunch of lists including a single lone Gravis Captain with the Artificer armor enhancement. Kind of fun to see them running solo. I guess that just gives you an enormously tanky single character model for interference and annoyance. That'd be 6 wounds with half damage, a 5+ feel no pain and a 2+ save, and still having enough attacks to make his presence felt against sort of medium infantry style units. I noticed a few armies running Desolation Squads as well, which I found interesting. I guess maybe could be a target for boosted Oath on turns where there aren't really any good targets otherwise, like turn 1. Interesting to see a few people experimenting with them again. For Ironstorm, it's obviously more emphasis on the vehicles, usually with Tech Marines to carry buffs, and they were certainly one of the other more taken units with a couple of other lists running them as well. Perhaps the other efficient Space Marine armour like Repulsor Executioners, Redemptor Dreadnoughts or Gladiator Lancers getting more of a look in here. And beyond that, just for some other fairly common things that are okay staples, Assault Intercessors are generally another good bodyguard unit. Given that they can give characters their reroll wound rolls, they maybe tend to be a bit more used by divergent chapters as opposed to the core ones though. The Phobos Librarian can be a maybe choice for some Infiltrators perhaps to stop them getting shot at long range. They feel like they'd be okay with Incursors on paper as well. Not sure if anyone's using them with those. Invader ATVs are nice cheap expendable units at just 60 points for a somewhat chunky fast mover. And a couple of lists use some impulsors, maybe things like Company Heroes with Uriel Ventris piling out of them, or other character combos. With the vast amount of things in the Space Marine army though, there's a lot of things that just notably don't seem to be used quite so much. The aggressors that were often being used at the start of the edition just really seem to have fallen off. I guess nerfing Fire Discipline, the Apothecary Biologist, and their own points being quite so high are all big contributors there. Terminators are still pretty well on played. The Landvader Redeemer no longer seems to be a big part of most competitive lists. I guess maybe not quite so much chance for luxury points investment if lots of lists are running big characters like Guilliman and Calgar sucking up a lot of the points. And other things with improved datasheets like Heavy Intercessors and Infernus Marines basically still on played as well. Maybe for units that are expected to see a little bit more of, seems that Stern Guards still aren't really all that popular despite potentially being incredibly damaging between their range and melee, particularly with an attached captain. The Predator Destructor I feel like really isn't all that far behind the Ballistus Dreadnought. Interesting to see basically everyone running the Ballistus but not the Predator. And I wouldn't have been too surprised to see a few more people trying out Outriders with their damage too. I still probably rate Jump Intercessors as the better choice overall myself. Though again I feel like for 80 points they're really not that far behind and are at least fairly sturdy. They do seem to be getting some love in Dark Angels though with their extra synergies that they get with them. In any case though, let me know your thoughts and experiences with Space Marine armies in 40k at the moment, after the vast amount of updates, which things have been seeing the tabletop for you, or seeing time on the shelf. Finally, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Titans Terrain. As mentioned, one way to get a tabletop full of 40k terrain, with their rather different folding tile sort of approach to the thing. They were fully happy with me talking about all the pros and cons for it. I wouldn't say it's the right sort of terrain for everyone out there, but definitely has its advantages for a good selection of people. It's really easy to store and transport due to packing away quite so small. It's far cheaper than an entire tabletop worth of Games Workshop terrain, at least somewhat comparable to MDF, and it's ready to go straight away with not needing any painting or assembly, if time's a big factor and you don't have the hobby hours to stretch to an entire board of terrain. The main disadvantages and criticisms that people say about it: it's less hard wearing and less sturdy than plastic or MDF terrain, given that it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. It can be difficult to put models in the upper stories of buildings due to the folding thing. The grid layout is a bit less flexible than some terrain sets, though you can get a bit of variety by rotating the tiles, and I'd probably just use a tiny bit of extra terrain to break up some firing lanes if it were me. It doesn't exactly make tournament-approved layouts as well if that's what you're looking for. In general though, I've had fairly good feedback that it works alright for casual games, and I've got a few different types and sets of it. There's this Forgotten Furnace one, which is sort of like a Chaos Foundry style theme, lots of factories and glowing runes. A more standard Shattered Hive one for a bunch of bombed out buildings and armoured containers. And then some more lush verdant ruins with this overgrown capital one, which could also be appropriate for fantasy type armies. Each of those options also have an expansion centerpiece type building, a big cathedral type place for the city or the capital, and a great big spire one for the furnace one. These ones made by 2 tiles pushed together to make a really big building. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and a big thank you to sponsoring the content on the channel. In any case, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep with the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel yourselves, then the channel does have a Patreon page linked down in the video description. That's the main thing that keeps all the videos coming so often. So a big thank you to any folks helping out there. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.